In the spring of 2011, at the Red Creek County Livestock Auction, Eli Vance paid $270 for 45 lambs nobody else would touch. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson who had known Eli for 40 years, paused after the gavel fell, holding the silence a moment too long. It wasn't a silence of respect. It was a silence of pity. The purchase was seen by the 150 farmers gathered in the dusty amphitheater as the final, sad act of a man losing his grip. Then Henderson cleared his throat, a dry rasp over the microphone, and moved on to a pen of healthy Angus yearlings. The story, however, did not move on. It had just begun. Let me tell you about Eli Vance. In 2011, he was 74 years old. He had been farming the same 280 acres of rolling land in southern Ohio for 61 of those years, since he was tall enough to reach the clutch on his father's Alice Chalmers Model G. He was a quiet man, known for two things: the worn, sweat-stained felt hat that seemed a permanent fixture on his head, and his habit of listening more than he spoke. He never offered an opinion unless asked, and even then, his answers were short, dense things, polished by long consideration. His physical presence was minimal. He was stooped from a lifetime of labor, his hands gnarled into permanent cups, the skin crosshatched with 1,000 healed cuts. He wore denim overalls and flannel shirts, regardless of the season. His connection to his land was not intellectual. It was cellular. It was in his bones. He carried in the breast pocket of his overalls a small, leather-bound notebook, no bigger than his palm, its pages yellowed and filled with the spidery script of his grandfather, his father, and himself. It contained planting dates, weather patterns, remedies for sick livestock, and observations on the behavior of wild things. It was a record of one family's conversation with one piece of land, stretching back 158 years. The Vance farm was not a modern operation. It was a place of inherited objects and inherited practices. The gate to the main pasture was hung in 1889 by Eli's great-grandfather, fashioned from black locust wood that had long ago petrified to the hardness of iron. It still swung true on its massive iron hinges. The kitchen table, where every meal was eaten, had been sawn from a single white oak that fell in the storm of 1907. Its surface was a map of family history, scarred with knife marks from trimming beans, darkened with rings from hot canning jars, and smoothed by the passage of 1,000,000 elbows. Eli still used the cloth seed bags his mother had sewn from bleached flour sacks, each one bearing the faded ghost of a milling company's logo. These were not heirlooms kept for sentiment. They were tools still fit for their purpose. This preference for the proven over the new was the source of a quiet, persistent friction between Eli and his only son, Liam. Liam Vance was 32 years old. He loved his father, but he saw the farm through a different lens. He had a degree in agribusiness from Ohio State, and he came home armed with spreadsheets, soil analysis reports, and a 5-year plan for modernization. He saw the old gate not as a legacy, but as an inefficiency. He saw the hand-saved seeds not as resilient, but as genetically inconsistent. He wanted to lease another 200 acres, invest in a new GPS-guided combine, and switch to a monoculture of high-yield, herbicide-resistant corn. He argued that the farm wasn't a museum. It was a business, and it was failing to keep pace. The numbers, he insisted, were undeniable. Profit margins were shrinking. The farm was solvent, but just barely. It was a slow, managed decline. Into this generational tension walked Marcus Thorne. Thorne was 38, a consultant from an agricultural advisory firm in Columbus. He was hired by the local farm co-op to help members improve their yields, and Liam had invited him out to the Vance property. Thorne was the epitome of the confident outsider. He was sharp, articulate, and dressed in branded polo shirts and clean work boots. He carried a tablet computer on which he could summon satellite imagery, soil composition data, and commodity futures projections. He was not a bad man. He was a well-meaning professional who genuinely believed that data could solve any problem. He saw farming as a set of variables to be optimized. He looked at Eli's leather notebook with a kind of anthropological curiosity, the way one might look at a flint arrowhead. He listened to Eli's quiet pronouncements about the land with polite, patient condescension. The focus of their disagreement, the epicenter of their conflicting worldviews, was a 30-acre parcel of land on the farm's northern edge. It was a steep, rocky hillside, choked with a nearly impenetrable tangle of multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, and wild grapevines. It was considered the most worthless part of the Vance property. The soil was thin and acidic, with a pH of 52 according to Thorne's digital probe. It hadn't been grazed or cultivated in at least 70 years. Local memory held that it was part of the original Hemlock Ridge settlement, abandoned sometime after the Civil War. It was a dead asset on the balance sheet, and Marcus Thorne had a plan for it. He proposed clear-cutting it, bringing in heavy machinery to terrace the slope, and applying 3 tons of lime and 400 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per acre to make it suitable for a cash crop of soybeans. The cost would be significant, around $42,000, but his projections showed it would pay for itself within 6 years. Liam was convinced. Eli was not. He would just stand at the edge of the overgrown plot, looking up into the dense thicket and say, "The hill has its own idea." This was the state of affairs on April 12, 2011, the day Eli drove his 1988 Ford F-150. Its blue paint faded to the color of a cloudy sky, 23 miles to the Red Creek County Livestock auction. He went alone. He told Liam he was just going to look, to see what the market was doing. He walked past the pens of healthy, well-fed cattle and hogs, the air thick with the smell of manure and sawdust. He ignored the prime livestock that drew the big bidders. He made his way to the back, to the miscellaneous pens, where the cull animals and the odd lots were held. This was the auction's remainder bin, the place for animals that were too old, too small, or too sick to bring a decent price. In a muddy pen at the far end, huddled together under the corrugated metal roof, were the 45 lambs. They were a motley collection of breeds, mostly Dorset and Suffolk crosses. They were runts, orphans, and triplets from the spring lambing season, animals that had failed to thrive. Their wool was ragged and patchy. Their bones showed through their hides. Several were coughing a wet, rattling sound. Their average weight was a mere 28 pounds, less than half of what a healthy lamb their age should weigh. They were, by any practical measure, worthless. Treating them with modern veterinary medicine would cost more than they would ever be worth as meat. Most farmers would simply knock them on the head to put them out of their misery. When their lot came up, the auctioneer, Henderson, didn't even try to build excitement. "All right, folks, lot 37. 45 head of feeder lambs. They are what they are. What am I bid to start 'em? Somebody give me $5 a head." The crowd was silent. A few men shook their heads. One farmer muttered to his neighbor. Dead on their feet, Henderson tried again. $5, take the whole lot. Come on, somebody start me, still nothing. He sighed, ready to declare them a no-sale and send them to the rendering plant. Then, from the back row, a single hand went up. It was Eli Vance. Henderson squinted. "Eli, you bidding?" Eli gave a short, sharp nod. "I got $5 from Eli Vance. Am I bid $6? Another farmer, more out of curiosity than genuine interest, raised a finger. "Got 6. Do I hear 7? Eli's hand went up again, but this time he didn't put it down. He just held it there, steady. Henderson looked around. There were no other bidders. The other farmer shrugged and shook his head, backing out. "Sold," Henderson said, his voice flat. "Torstai Eli Vance. 45 head at $6. That's $270. He banged the gavel, and the sound seemed to echo the community's judgment. Eli walked to the office, paid his $270 in cash, and went to get his truck and trailer. The other farmers watched him go, a mixture of pity and disbelief on their faces. They saw a stubborn old man throwing good money after bad, clinging to a past that was gone. They did not see a man with a plan that had been germinating for 50 years. The drive home was quiet. The lambs bleated weakly in the trailer behind him. When he pulled into the farm lane, Liam was waiting for him, his arms crossed over his chest. He had heard the news. In a small community, word of a foolish purchase travels faster than a storm front. Marcus Thorne was with him, standing beside his clean, company-leased SUV. Liam spoke first. "Dad, what did you do?" The question was heavy with disappointment. "Bought some lambs," Eli said, shutting the truck door. "Some lambs? Dad, I got a call from Jim at the feed store. He said you bought the cull pen. The whole thing. They needed a home." Liam ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "We're not a charity. We're a farm. We can't afford to be a hospice for sick animals." He turned to the consultant. "Marcus, tell him." Marcus Thorne stepped forward, holding his tablet. He adopted a calm, reasonable tone, the voice of a man explaining a simple truth to a child. "Mr. Vance, I understand the sentiment. But from an economic standpoint, this is an indefensible decision." He tapped the screen. "The current market price for a healthy 70-pound feeder lamb is approximately $180 per pound, or $126 per head. To get these lambs to that weight, assuming they even survive, will require intensive veterinary care, high-protein supplemental feed, and at least 4 months of pasture. My most optimistic projection, which assumes only a 50% mortality rate, puts your total investment at around $4,800. Your return, if you're lucky, would be less than $3,000. You are guaranteed to lose money." His projection for a 90% loss rate, which he considered more realistic, was a net loss of over $6,000, factoring in the cost of disposal for the carcasses. He had it all on a spreadsheet, the columns neat, the conclusion inescapable. Eli listened, his eyes on the overgrown hillside in the distance. He nodded slowly when Thorne was finished. "Your numbers are probably right," he said. "Then why?" Liam's voice cracked. "Why would you do this?" "Because you're measuring the wrong thing," Eli said. "You're measuring the lambs. You should be measuring the hill." Thorne exchanged a look with Liam. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect, the hill is even worse. We've discussed this. The forage quality is non-existent. The soil is poor. It can't support healthy livestock, let alone sick ones. It's a closed system of nutrient deficiency." "The data doesn't know the hill," Eli said, repeating his quiet mantra. The conversation was over. Eli backed his trailer up to the loading ramp of a small holding pen. He let the lambs out. They stumbled into the pen, weak and disoriented. While Liam and Thorne watched in disbelief from the farmhouse porch, Eli went to the old milking barn. He didn't get a bag of commercial feed or a bottle of penicillin. He came back with a galvanized steel bucket and a large mortar and pestle that had belonged to his grandmother. He walked into the woods behind the barn and began gathering things: the leaves of wild plantain, the feathery tops of yarrow, and the bitter, silver-green foliage of wormwood. He ground them together in the mortar, adding a little water and a scoop of blackstrap molasses from a sticky jar in the pantry. He was making the drench his grandfather had written about in the notebook, a remedy for scours and internal parasites, a recipe that predated modern antibiotics by a century. One by one, he caught each lamb. He held the struggling animal between his knees, tilted its head back, and used a large syringe, the only piece of modern equipment he employed, to squirt the dark, pungent mixture down its throat. The lambs fought him, but his old hands were surprisingly strong. Took him nearly 2 hours. When he was done, he herded the 45 lambs out of the pen and up the lane toward the worthless hillside. He opened the rickety wire gate, a gate that hadn't been used in his lifetime, and drove the lambs through. Then he closed it behind them. He didn't put out any feed or water. There was a small, spring-fed creek that trickled down from the top of the hill, and for the rest, they would have to fend for themselves. Liam and Marcus watched the whole spectacle unfold. It wasn't just a bad business decision anymore. To them, it looked like cruelty. It looked like madness. The first few weeks seemed to confirm their worst fears. From the road, they could see the lambs, small, pathetic dots of white against the dense green and brown of the hillside. They didn't appear to be grazing so much as hiding. 2 of them died in the first 10 days. Eli found their small bodies, carried them down, and buried them without a word. The loss was 44%, well on its way to Marcus Thorne's projected 90%. The gossip in the community intensified. The story of Eli's folly was a regular topic of conversation at the feed store and the local diner. People felt sorry for Liam. Eli, however, was not discouraged. Every morning, just after dawn, he would walk the fence line of the 30-acre plot. He didn't go in. He just watched. He carried a pair of old binoculars and his grandfather's notebook. He observed the lambs' behavior. He noted that they weren't eating the lush, fast-growing grasses near the creek. Instead, they were picking their way through the undergrowth, nibbling at the leaves of specific plants. They were voraciously eating the broadleaf plantain, one of the key ingredients in his herbal drench. They were stripping the leaves from young briars. They were seeking out things that conventional wisdom would call weeds. They were, in their own instinctive way, medicating themselves. Eli recorded it all in his careful, blocky handwriting. After a month, a subtle change began. The coughing stopped. The lambs started to move with more energy. Their coats began to lose their ragged look. They were still thin, but they were no longer skeletal. They started to form a proper flock, moving across the face of the hill as a single unit. Their genius, it turned out, was their weakness. Because they were small and not bred for rapid, grain-fed growth, their nutritional needs were lower. And because they had been raised in marginal conditions, they had not lost the instinct to forage for a diverse diet. A healthy, commercially bred lamb would have starved on that hillside. But these lambs, the rejects, knew how to survive on it. Their most important work was mechanical. They were living brush hogs. They ate what they could reach. They trampled what they couldn't. Their sharp little hooves broke up the matted layer of dead vegetation on the ground, allowing sunlight and rain to reach the soil for the first time in decades. They were particularly effective against the multiflora rose. They couldn't eat the thorny canes, but they devoured every new, tender shoot that emerged from the base of the plants, slowly starving the massive root systems. They were a patient, persistent, 43-headed army of landscapers. Marcus Thorne made a follow-up visit in July, 3 months after the purchase. He drove up the lane and met Liam on the porch. He was polite, but his expression was that of a doctor visiting a terminal patient. He looked up at the hillside. "Well," he said, trying to sound encouraging, "it looks like you've lost fewer than I predicted. That's something from a distance." The change was not dramatic. The hill was still a mess of overgrown brush. But Thorne, with his eye for data, did notice something. "They seem to be clearing the understory a bit," he conceded. "It's an interesting, if uneconomical, method of land management." He took some soil samples, made some notes on his tablet, and left. His report to the co-op noted that the Vance farm was engaged in a high-risk, low-yield heritage farming experiment with a negligible chance of positive economic return. By late autumn, a year and a half after the lambs arrived, the transformation was undeniable. The flock, now numbering 43 healthy, full-grown sheep, had systematically cleared the entire understory of the 30-acre hillside. They had worked their way from the bottom to the top, a slow, methodical tide of grazing. The multiflora rose was gone, reduced to dried, leafless skeletons. The barberry was gone. The poison ivy was gone. The tangled mess of grapevines had been chewed back to their main trunks. What was left was a scattering of mature hardwood trees, oak, hickory, and maple, and a floor of native grasses that had been waiting patiently in the seed bank for their chance at the sun. But that was not the most significant change. As the suffocating blanket of invasive species was peeled back, something else was revealed. Something orderly. Something that was not the product of wild nature. On the upper half of the slope, arranged in a grid pattern that was now starkly visible, were rows of old, gnarled trees. They were crooked, their bark thick and shaggy, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. They were apple trees, dozens of them. It was an orchard, a forgotten orchard, planted by settlers nearly 2 centuries ago, and lost to the forest for the better part of one. The sheep had not just cleared the land. They had uncovered a piece of history. The decisive moment came on a crisp afternoon in late September of 2012. Marcus Thorne arrived for what he told Liam would be his final assessment. He had his report already drafted. It would state, professionally and dispassionately, that the project had failed to produce any economic value and served as a case study in the dangers of sentimentalism in modern agriculture. He intended to walk the property one last time, to finalize his notes. Eli met him at the gate to the hillside. Liam was there too, looking nervous. "Let's take a walk," Eli said. He didn't wait for an answer, just unlatched the wire gate and started up the slope. The three men walked in silence. The sheep, grazing peacefully near the crest of the hill, lifted their heads to watch them pass. They were magnificent animals now, their coats thick and clean, their bodies robust. They were a flock born of resilience. Marcus Thorne was quiet. He was looking at the ground, at the healthy turf of clover and orchard grass that the sheep's grazing and manure had fostered. He was looking at the dead canes of the invasive roses, which would soon decay and enrich the soil. He was running calculations in his head. The cost of clearing this land with machinery would have been immense. The cost of fertilizing it would have been high. Eli Vance had accomplished the same result with a one-time investment of $270 and a flock of animals that were now a valuable asset in their own right. The wool clip alone would be worth over $500. The value of the lambs, if sold for meat, was now over $8,000. It was not the spectacular failure he had predicted. It was, in fact, a modest success. But he still didn't understand the full picture. He was still measuring the wrong thing. They reached the top of the hill, and for the first time Marcus saw the orchard clearly. He stopped. He was looking at about 15 acres of evenly spaced, mature apple trees. They were laden with fruit. But these were not modern apples. They weren't the uniform, glossy red or green orbs found in a supermarket. They were a bizarre and beautiful assortment of shapes, sizes, and colors. Some were small and dark purple, almost black. Some were flattened and yellow with a rough, brownish skin. Some were conical and striped with red and green. Others were lumpy and golden, covered in a web of russeting. He had never seen anything like them. He walked to the nearest tree and touched one of the apples. Felt dense, heavy for its size. He turned to Eli, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "What is this?" "It's the old hemlock orchard," Eli said. "My grandfather mentions it in his book. Said it was planted around 1830. The settlement failed, the people moved on, and the forest took it back. But the trees remembered their rows." Thorne was speechless. He was a man of data, of known variables. This was an unknown variable. This was something his spreadsheets could not account for. He had analyzed the soil, the slope, the rainfall. He had never thought to analyze the history. He had never considered what might be hidden underneath the noise of the present. Eli Vance walked to a tree bearing a lumpy, greenish-yellow apple. He picked one, its skin feeling like fine-grained sandpaper. He polished it on the sleeve of his flannel shirt, a slow, circular motion. The friction released a spicy, complex aroma into the cool autumn air. He held it out to Marcus Thorne. The consultant took the apple. He looked at it, then at Eli, then at the flock of sheep that had made this revelation possible. He took a bite. The flesh was crisp, dense, and intensely flavored. A cascade of sugar and acid and spice that bore no resemblance to the one-dimensional sweetness of a modern commercial apple. Tasted of the place it came from. Tasted of time. That single apple changed everything. Thorne, to his credit, was not a man to deny the evidence of his own senses. He took a box of the apples back to Columbus with him. He sent them not to an agricultural lab, but to a pomologist at the university, an old professor who specialized in heirloom fruits. The report that came back a few weeks later was staggering. The orchard contained 87 trees, representing 14 distinct, pre-industrial apple varieties. 6 of them, including the black gilliflower and the Asopus Spitzenbug, were rare heirlooms highly prized by connoisseurs. 3 others were so unusual the professor couldn't positively identify them. They were likely local seedlings, unique to that one hillside. They were, he wrote in his report, a genetic treasure trove, a living museum of American apples. Their resistance to scab and fire blight, developed over a century of untended survival, was remarkable. The news spread, not through agricultural journals, but through the niche world of craft food and drink. A story about the rediscovered orchard appeared on a popular food blog. That blog post was read by the owner of a small, ambitious cidery located 97 miles away in Cincinnati. He drove out to the Vance farm unannounced, his car a cloud of dust on the gravel lane. He walked the orchard with Eli. He tasted the apples. He saw the potential not for a sweet, mass-market cider, but for a complex, dry, European-style cider that would command a premium price. He made Eli an offer on the spot. He would pay for the harvest, transport the apples, press them, and ferment them. He offered Eli $0.75 per pound. It was a staggering price, more than 10 times what ordinary apples fetched for juice. The first harvest, gathered by Eli, Liam, and a small crew from the cidery, yielded 24,600 pounds of apples. The first check Eli received was for $18,450. It was more profit than the rest of the farm had generated in the previous 3 years combined. The money was significant, but it was not the most important outcome. The real change was in Liam. He had witnessed a different kind of logic prevail, a logic that was slower, deeper, and more complex than the profit and loss statements he had learned in school. He started spending his evenings at the oak kitchen table, not with his laptop, but with his great-grandfather's leather notebook. He asked Eli about the herbal drench, about the way the sheep moved, about the history of every pasture and woodlet. He began to understand that the farm was not a factory for producing commodities, but a complex, living system, a web of relationships between soil, plants, animals, and people. The quiet, inherited wisdom of his father, which he had once dismissed as nostalgia, now seemed like a profound form of science. Marcus Thorne was also transformed. He wrote a new report, one that was circulated widely within his firm and beyond. It was not about profit margins and chemical inputs. It was about the economic value of biodiversity, the role of livestock in ecosystem restoration, and the importance of integrating historical knowledge with modern science. He called it the Vance Protocol. His career took a new trajectory. He became a leading advocate for regenerative agriculture, a man who now carried a soil probe in one hand and a history book in the other. His confidence was still there, but it was no longer brittle. It had been tempered by humility. The aftermath rippled across the community for years. The story of Eli's folly became the legend of the Orchard of the Lambs. Other farmers in the county, men who had laughed at Eli in the auction house, started looking at their own overgrown hillsides with new eyes. They started asking questions. A small cooperative was formed to identify and restore other forgotten orchards in the region. The Vance farm became a model. Liam, taking over the day-to-day operations, did not abandon his education. Instead, he began to weave the two threads of knowledge together. He used satellite imagery to identify other potential restoration sites on their land. He used DNA testing to catalog the genetics of the heirloom apples. He used the internet to market their unique, place-based products directly to consumers. The old Locustwood Gate now led to a farm that was both ancient and modern, a place where the past was not a liability, but the foundation of a resilient future. Eli Vance lived to be 88. He never lost his quiet nature. He continued his daily walks, making notes in his book until his hand grew too shaky to write. He saw the farm thrive in a way he had never thought possible. He saw his son become the farmer he had always hoped he would be, a man who understood that the health of the land and the health of the business were the same thing. He died in the same house he was born in, looking out the window at the hillside, now a patchwork of green pasture and the dark, orderly rows of the old trees. What survives is not always what is strongest, or what is most profitable in the short term. The world is full of value that our spreadsheets cannot measure. It is hidden in the weeds, buried in the soil, and tucked away in the memories of old men. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to see potential where others see only waste. The 45 sickly lambs were not a liability. They were the key. The overgrown hill was not a dead asset. It was a locked room holding a treasure, and the quiet farmer who saw the connection between them was not a fool. He was a man who knew that the land keeps its promises, but it speaks in a language that takes generations to learn. It is a language of patience, of observation, of humility. It is the language of a healthy system, where the well-being of one part is inextricably linked to the well-being of all the others. The data does not know the hill, but the lambs did, and that is what matters.